So, what if I told you Jim Jones just watched his so-called $100 million dream deal with rocnation go poof vanish faster than his Billboard bragging rights because Nas allegedly clowned him so hard in private that the industry couldn't stop laughing? What if I told you this isn't just about rap beef? It's about humiliation, power moves, and a level of petty so elite it should be in the Smithsonian. Oh, you think I'm exaggerating? Well, buckle up, because the streets are saying the paperwork was already on Jay-Z's desk until one quiet dinner between Nas, LeBron James, and a few mystery billionaires turned into a savage roast session that somehow derailed everything. Coincidence? Please. Now, ask yourself this. How does a man go from begging for a feature, calling Nas the GOAT, to standing on podcasts, swearing he'd run circles around him, only to end up with his biggest bag snatched right out of his hands? Is it karma? Is it industry chess? Or is it just Jim doing what Jim does best, talking his way into a wall? And the real kicker? Insiders are whispering that rocnation didn't just cancel the deal, they replaced it with something so disrespectful, Jim might never recover. Stay tuned, because this rabbit hole goes way deeper than you think. Let's rewind the tape, because this mess didn't just happen overnight, and the fall of Jim Jones's so-called $100 million rocnation deal is the kind of industry soap opera you couldn't make up even if you tried. The type of behind-the-scenes chaos that makes you realize half of these rappers are living in a fantasy world held together with sponsored posts and free bottles at VIP tables. So picture Jim walking into private boardrooms like he's already the new king of rocnation, shades on indoors, chewing gum like he's about to negotiate world peace, telling anyone who will listen that this is going to be the biggest move of his career, casually mentioning generational wealth every other sentence like he's been watching too many TED Talks. Meanwhile, Nas is somewhere in the background, not saying a single word but playing the kind of long game that doesn't need a press release because, according to a source close to the situation, who insists on being called the guy in the corner, Nas caught wind of Jim's little victory lap before it even started and made one very quiet phone call that allegedly changed everything. And when I say allegedly, I mean the kind of allegedly that comes with a smirk, because you know, there's more to the story than anyone will admit on record. Apparently, rocnation execs started digging, not because they were worried about money but because suddenly every person in the room remembered every time Jim opened his mouth over the past year to take random shots at Nas, calling himself the more relevant, more influential, more viral artist, and the execs started asking themselves if it made sense to bring in someone who might publicly throw shade at one of hip-hop's most respected figures while wearing their logo on his chest. And that is when the whispers started. Whispers about the 2003 Dipset vs. Nas mixtape shots. Whispers about Jim bragging on podcasts that he could run circles around Nas in the booth. Whispers about the fact that Billboard themselves had to step in and fact-check Jim because his statistics were about as real as a reality show marriage. And it all started to pile up, until one meeting turned into another, and the tone shifted from "when do we sign?" to "maybe we should revisit the terms," and then to actually "let's put this on hold," which in music industry language is code for "we're never calling you again, but good luck out there, champ." Now you have to understand, Jim wasn't ready for that because in his mind this was already a done deal. He'd been hyping it to people like it was set in stone, telling friends to get ready for the next big era, hinting that he was about to be working directly under Hav, even floating the idea of some rocnation x Vampire Life cross-branding that would shake the culture. But when the calls stopped coming and the emails slowed to a crawl, the frustration started boiling over, and instead of letting it go quietly like most artists would when they realized they got curved, Jim doubled down in the most Jim Jones way possible by jumping on every podcast and Instagram live he could find to remind everyone that he was still the apex and more influential than Nas ever was. Basically talking like he was still in the running when insiders say the contract had already been shredded and recycled into office printer paper. And this is where it gets messy because the streets love a good back and forth, but this wasn't even that. Nas wasn't biting, wasn't commenting, wasn't even looking in Jim's direction, which made Jim's outbursts look less like a lyrical battle and more like that one uncle at the cookout who keeps trying to start an argument no one else is interested in. And of course the internet noticed, with memes flooding Twitter showing Nas having dinner with billionaires while Jim was allegedly outside pulling up on anyone who disagreed with him. Then came the viral clip that really lit the fire. A grainy video from some industry event where Nas, looking relaxed with a glass of wine, allegedly joked to someone off camera about not knowing a single Jim Jones record. And whether or not he said it exactly like that doesn't even matter, because by the time the clip hit social media, the caption read, "Nas says Jim Jones isn't worth writing about," and that was enough to send Jim into another round of interviews where he tried to play it cool but ended up sounding even more pressed, throwing out lines like he ain't never been talked about like this in his life, as if going viral for being in a fake beef with some kind of Grammy category. And the wildest part is that in between these shots he would still slip in these moments of respect, calling Nas one of his favorites from back in the day and admitting he once tried to get him on a track, which just made the whole thing feel even more like a messy breakup where one person alternates between insults and love letters, leaving everyone else wondering what exactly the end goal is here. But behind the scenes, the story gets even juicier because according to an anonymous ROC Nation staffer who I may or may not have bribed with overpriced coffee, the decision to kill Jim's deal wasn't just about the Nas drama. Oh no. They claimed there was also concern about financial optics after some very unflattering lifestyle receipts surfaced showing alleged wild spending sprees, nights at exclusive clubs with 5-figure bottle tabs, luxury shopping binges in Paris that ended up on Instagram before the invoices were even paid, and even a rumor about a business meeting in Miami that was basically just an all-day yacht party complete with a personal photographer to make it look like work. And while all of that might sound like standard rapper behavior, when you're pitching yourself to a corporate giant that likes their artists polished and drama-free, it becomes a red flag big enough to hang off the top of the Barclays Center. By this point, whispers about the deal being off had made it into group chats, into the DMs of blog pages, into late-night phone calls between industry gatekeepers, and while nobody wanted to say it on record, everyone was saying it off record, that ROC Nation had quietly backed out, and Jim was either in denial or doing damage control. And in a rare move for the man known to clap back at everything, Jay-Z himself stayed completely out of it, offering no confirmation, no denial, just letting the silence do the talking while Nas's Instagram photo with LeBron and a table full of millionaires served as the unofficial "you can't sit with us" moment of the summer. A moment that fans immediately connected to the rumors about Jim being iced out, flooding the comments with jokes about the meeting Jim wishes he was invited to, and Nas securing $100 million just by having dinner, while Jim, perhaps realizing the optics were getting worse by the day, started posting more Jim videos and motivational captions like nothing had happened, which honestly just made it more obvious that something had happened. And now we're left with the picture of a rapper who tried to step into a bigger league but underestimated the power of quiet moves made by people who don't need to prove anything because they've already done it all and then some. By the time the second wave of rumors hit the internet, it was no longer just about a deal gone wrong. It had morphed into a full-scale character assassination campaign with every podcast host, YouTube commentator, and even random verified Twitter accounts joining in on the pile-on, throwing around wild unverified claims that made the whole thing feel like a never-ending soap opera. And the craziest part was that every new allegation, no matter how ridiculous, somehow stuck to Jim's image, like glue, feeding the narrative that he had been reckless, arrogant, and blind to the power moves happening right under his nose. And while Jim's inner circle tried to downplay it, insisting that this was all the work of jealous industry rivals, there was no denying that something behind the scenes had shifted, because the same outlets that used to hype up his every move were now publishing think pieces about whether his career had peaked years ago, and if this ROC Nation deal was his last real shot at mainstream relevance. People began dissecting his old interviews in forensic detail, pointing out moments where he might have burned bridges without realizing it, like the time he dismissed Nas's business ventures as not really moving the culture, or the Instagram Live rant where he laughed about never needing corporate backing because the streets feed me, which aged terribly when the streets started laughing right back at him. Then came the so-called leaked meeting notes, allegedly from a ROC Nation board discussion where executives supposedly debated whether bringing Jim in would be worth the potential PR headaches, and the document claimed that one exec specifically referenced recent inflammatory statements towards respected artists as a major concern. And while no one could verify the authenticity of those notes, the way they were written sounded just believable enough to set social media on fire for days, with threads breaking down every possible coded message hidden in them. Nas's camp stayed completely quiet, which only added to the mystique and power of the situation, because the absence of a response from someone with his level of influence spoke volumes, and left the internet to fill in the blanks with their own wild theories, including one that claimed Nas had orchestrated the entire collapse of the deal by calling in favors from powerful allies in the business world who owed him for past collaborations and investments. Meanwhile, Jim kept trying to project strength, posting expensive studio sessions, flashy jewelry drops, and snippets of unreleased tracks that he teased as next level. But every time he uploaded something, the comment section would derail into a debate about whether he should be focusing on repairing his image instead of flaunting wealth that many now believed was quickly drying up. Things hit another low point when a gossip blogger dropped what they claimed was an internal financial breakdown, showing that Jim had been relying on anticipated rocnation money to fund several big projects, including a luxury clothing line and a documentary series, both of which were now allegedly in limbo. And this only fueled more speculation that his finances were far shakier than he let on. The public loved it because nothing fuels the gossip economy like the image of a high-profile figure scrambling to hold it together, while pretending everything is fine. And as much as Jim tried to spin the story in his favor, the damage was already done, with memes comparing him to characters from old mafia movies who didn't realize the hit was coming until it was too late. Adding to the mess was the sudden appearance of a mysterious Twitter account claiming to be a former rocnation insider, who posted cryptic messages about how some battles are fought in silence and the chessboard is bigger than you think, which everyone immediately interpreted as shots at Jim, and whether the account was legit or just someone clout-chasing it, kept the conspiracy flames burning hot. The mainstream press eventually caught wind of the chaos with entertainment news segments, running dramatic recaps of the so-called feud and framing it as a cautionary tale about hubris in the music industry, painting Jim as a talented but reckless player who let personal grudges sabotage professional opportunities. And whether or not that was fair, it stuck because it was the kind of narrative that fit neatly into the public's understanding of how this business works. The fallout was now spilling into real life too, with whispers that certain promoters were hesitant to book Jim for high-profile gigs out of fear that his name would bring unnecessary drama, or that he might use the stage as a platform to air more grievances against powerful people who could make life difficult for them. At the same time, Nas seemed to be thriving even more, with reports of new investments, partnerships, and collaborations popping up every other week, each one serving as another silent reminder of who came out on top in this silent war. And while Nas never addressed the situation directly, his fans made sure the contrast stayed front and center by flooding timelines with side-by-side comparisons of his achievements and Jim's setbacks. All of this created a perfect storm where the perception of Jim as an unstoppable hustler was crumbling in real time, replaced by the image of a man who had been strategically outmaneuvered at every turn. And the fact that the alleged $100 million number kept being repeated over and over in headlines, whether or not it was accurate, cemented the idea that he had lost something massive and irreplaceable. The irony was that in trying to prove he was above the politics of the industry, Jim had walked straight into its most dangerous trap, underestimating how powerful silent alliances could be, and overestimating how much control he really had over his own narrative once it left his hands and entered the social media echo chamber, where the loudest voices often drown out the truth. By the time the dust began to settle, the damage was irreversible because it was no longer about whether the deal had been real or inflated. It was about the fact that Jim had become the butt of a joke that the entire culture seemed to be in on. And in the cutthroat world of hip-hop, where image is currency, that kind of loss can be more devastating than any financial setback. What made the situation spiral even further was that just when people thought the conversation might die down, new so-called revelations began surfacing from exclusive industry insiders who claimed that the rocnation deal was not just a simple business arrangement but part of a much larger strategic push to reshape the hip-hop landscape, and that Jim's involvement had been positioned as a key move in a plan worth far more than the headline grabbing $100 million figure. And according to these shadowy sources, Jim's abrupt removal was not just about personal grudges or his history of public outbursts, but also about whispered concerns over hidden alliances, conflicts of interest, and financial liabilities that no one had been talking about until now, which of course made the public even more invested, because nothing sells better than the idea of a grand conspiracy operating behind the scenes. Suddenly, forums and podcasts were flooded with detailed timelines connecting unrelated events, painting Jim as someone who had unknowingly stumbled into a minefield, where his past actions and statements were being used as ammunition against him by people who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And one particular theory that caught fire suggested that Nas had deliberately played the long game, letting old tensions simmer quietly while building his network until he could pull strings in ways that would never be traced back to him directly. Social media users became amateur detectives digging through old interviews and Instagram posts looking for hidden clues about when the falling out really began and whether this was payback for some unseen slight from years ago, and each time a new clip or screenshot emerged it was treated like a smoking gun, even if the context was flimsy or entirely fabricated. Meanwhile, Jim seemed increasingly frustrated with how the narrative had slipped out of his control, lashing out in sporadic live streams where he alternated between insisting that the deal was never finalized to begin with and hinting that powerful forces had sabotaged it out of jealousy and fear of his potential. But the more he spoke, the more the comments section turned his words into punchlines, twisting his explanations into memes that spread faster than the original rumors. This only deepened the impression that he was on the defensive and in the ruthless court of public opinion. Once you are painted as the desperate party trying to explain yourself, you are already losing the battle. Because people prefer a silent, confident winner over a loud, scrambling loser. Brands that once celebrated his hustle began quietly distancing themselves, either delaying collaborations or suddenly going in another creative direction, and insiders whispered that some of these decisions came directly from pressure exerted by people aligned with Nas, which, whether true or not, fit perfectly into the revenge fantasy narrative that had taken over the gossip cycle. The idea that this was more than a personal beef, but a calculated industry power play, gave the story an almost cinematic quality, with Nas cast as the smooth chess master and Jim as the street-hardened soldier who underestimated the elegance of the enemy's strategy and paid the price. Every time Nas posted anything online, whether it was about music business or even a family moment, people flooded the comments with applause, emojis, and cryptic references to the deal collapse, treating him like a folk hero for taking down someone they saw as arrogant or out of touch. At the same time, Jim's online engagement was a mix of loyal fans defending him and trolls baiting him into saying something that could be screen-grabbed and used as more evidence of his instability and inability to handle pressure. The tension reached a peak when a well-known gossip channel claimed to have obtained audio from a private industry dinner where Nas allegedly made lighthearted yet cutting remarks about never investing in someone who doesn't understand the long game, and while the authenticity of the clip was questionable, it didn't matter because it played directly into the public's perception of him as calmly dismissive of Jim's entire approach to business. That clip was replayed endlessly, with reaction videos breaking down every word, tone, and pause, as if it were a presidential debate, and each analysis added another layer to the mythos of Nas as the ultimate tactician. By now, the consequences for Jim were undeniable, with reports of cancelled appearances, shelved projects, and strained relationships with key gatekeepers who didn't want to risk crossing the wrong side of a quietly brewing Cold War within the industry. And whether those reports were exaggerated or not, they became part of the accepted reality. Because once a scandal reaches that level of cultural penetration, the truth is irrelevant, the perception is everything. In the end, Jim's attempts to rally public sympathy backfired, because instead of framing himself as a victim of political maneuvering, he came off as someone bitter about losing a game he didn't fully understand. And the tragedy for him was that in trying to win the battle of narratives, he had handed his opponents exactly what they needed to keep the spotlight on his missteps. Nas, on the other hand, emerged untouched, without ever having to raise his voice or confirm a single detail, which only reinforced the aura of quiet dominance that kept his reputation intact and made him look even more powerful than before. The cultural conversation had shifted entirely from "was Jim wronged?" to "how did he let this happen?" and that subtle change sealed his fate in the eyes of both fans and industry players. Even months later, whenever his name came up in discussions about business deals or artist management, someone would inevitably bring up the rocnation debacle as a cautionary tale about the importance of humility, discretion, and knowing when to play offense versus defense. And that kind of lasting association can haunt a career far longer than any temporary financial loss. For Nas, it was a victory without fingerprints, a lesson in how to win by letting others destroy themselves while you sit back and let the narrative do all the work. And for Jim, it was a reminder that in an industry built on perception, the wrong move at the wrong time can erase years of grind in the blink of an eye, and no amount of street credibility can shield you from the kind of quiet, calculated moves that happen in boardrooms far away from the spotlight he thought he understood so well. So now that you've heard the whole messy, twisted, and absolutely wild saga, the question is, what do you think really went down here? Was this just a case of bad business decisions and bruised egos? Or are we looking at a full-blown industry takedown, straight out of a Netflix drama? Did Nas actually pull strings behind the scenes to cancel that $100 million dream deal? Or is Jim just spinning a loss into a conspiracy? And more importantly, Who's going to survive this PR battlefield with their reputation intact? I want to hear from you, the real detectives of the internet. Because you know the blogs and insiders will never tell the whole truth. Drop your theories, your hot takes, and your wildest guesses in the comments below. Don't hold back. Because you know this is where the real tea gets spilled. And if you're living for these deep dives into the shadiest corners of the music world, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next jaw-dropping breakdown. Trust me, the stories I've got lined up will make this one look like child's play.